whenever there's trouble, G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American hero. G.I. Joe is there. It's G.I. Joe against Cobra and Destro, fighting to save the day. He never gives up. He's always there, fighting for freedom.
Thanks so much again for joining us here on this week's edition of Tricky Kid Radio. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about with you today is that when you got contacted to do, I'll go ahead and hold this so we can get a better audio here. When you got contacted to restart the G.I. Joe with IDW back in 2010, how did that whole situation go about? How did they contact you? What were your thoughts? Where were you at in your career at that point?
I was probably out of work. I went through about maybe 6 or 7 years with actually 5 years with almost no work at all.
Okay.
Nobody at Marvel or DC would answer my calls. But the thing is that I had always had a tough time getting work, writing work.
You mean after the original Marvel ended in '95, or just period?
Well, period. I mean, the only reason I got to write G.I. Joe was that they asked everybody else and they all turned it down.
I've heard that story before.
Yeah. So, and even after it became a hit, I would say, well, look, it's the number one selling book in the country, can't I write something else for you guys? And they would say, well, no, you can only do that military stuff, and you only have that one book.
So they were kind of thought of you as being kind of pigeonholed in a sense in terms of.
Well, everybody at Marvel told me that if I did a toy license book, which is like the bottom of the barrel, I would never get an A-list book offered to me for the rest of my life. And they were right. I was never offered an A-list book while it was an A-list book. So,
but do you think it was for the reasons they said it was, though?
Well, probably for a number of reasons. I didn't fit into all the categories. I was sort of an outsider in a way. I didn't hang out.
Right. So there's some politics there within kind of the group.
I actually had girlfriends.
we were just talking about that. I was like a welcome feminine presence here today, right?
It was, my whole life wasn't about doing comics. I was playing in rock and roll bands.
Right.
I was acting. I had all sorts of outside interests.
Yeah. Well, because one thing by following you and I are personal friends on Facebook, but one thing I've really enjoyed is kind of the non-comic stuff. Is that I lived in Brooklyn for about 8 years. I'm from here, but you're very much kind of an old punk from the village, aren't you? Like,
pretty much.
Yeah. And I was, and what's so funny is that after knowing that, and after living in Brooklyn for those years, it actually helped me going back in some of the books I read as a kid, growing up in the middle of nowhere. I was kind of like getting a lot of your references later on. So this is the early 80s. You're like, again, this kind of like an old punk from the village, not really swimming in those circles. And so you think it kind of hurt your career in terms long term, or I mean, clearly not, because you had, again, one of the most popular, long-lasting books of all time.
Well, I wrote G.I. Joe for 14 years. I wrote Wolverine for 8 years. And during all those years, I never got invited to a single convention. Why do you think that is? Because the fanboys at the time didn't like me. I wasn't, it's like they could sniff my butt and tell I wasn't one of them.
See, you see how full circle this is coming here?
Yeah, I like it.
Before we came, I was kind of explaining kind of the dynamic about that.
Yeah. So, and it wasn't until they aged out, and the kids that read my stuff when they were 10 grew into those slots.
Right, for sure.
Now, kids that read my stuff run cons or own shops,
right?
Or, you know, or are editors, or
right,
you know, whatever. So
who grew up with it and
yeah.
and have a you know, this lifelong appreciation.
Yeah. So you know, I had to just tough it out. I mean, it was every month I had to keep writing this book that got no love from anybody, you know, except the actual readers. I got hundreds of letters a week from kids.
Right.
You know? And I made it a point to answer as many of those as I could. I sent out postcards. I had a couple of years ago, this woman, Jennifer, came up to me at a con, and she had the postcard I sent to her.
Oh my gosh.
That I sent to her when she was 10.
Oh, and she cherished it her entire life.
Yeah, and she brought it with her to show it to me. You know, but it was very weird because like I would go, they would ask me to go do signings at shops, you know, and I would go to. The first time I went to one, it was in Washington, well, actually in Alexandria, Virginia. And I got there. I drove down from New York with my wife, and I said, "Well, this should only take like, you know, an hour or so." And we got there, and there was a line that went outside the shop all the way around the block.
Oh my gosh!
And
because you weren't really aware of.
No, so I sat there for something like 6 hours. Because I didn't want to like cut off the line and just.
For sure, of course not.
So if a kid is standing on line for 3 hours, I'm not going to say, well, that's
right.
That's it.
Of course not. Of course.
So,
right.
So my wife said, look, you know, I'm going to go to the mall.
Well, that's what I was telling you whenever we were talking, corresponding, was that I would want to, you know, come between you and the readers. I'm one of those readers and have been, you know, for my entire life as well. So, but don't you think that your status now is this one of, it's really one of notoriety and respect, and you've earned that. I mean,
well, not, you know, to my fans, but you know, I'm still like a non-entity to most editors.
Well,
you know, in the business, you know, I always had a hell of a time getting work. You know.
But so when IDW called you, and I'm going to show this for the camera here, so they can see it. Is and this is why this is important. So I'm going to bring this up here. Is that this is, of course, the 155 and a half issue here. So for those that are watching, it's also, of course, we're streaming on our channel as well. But is that G.I. Joe ended, of course, in 1995, right, with issue 155. You wrote 153 of those issues, right?
Well, maybe 150. Yeah, but there was a half a dozen issues I didn't write.
Right, but still, come on, he's the man, he's the face of it. So the reason why this is important is because tell me another comic book where 15 years after the fact, instead of starting at number one, which they would have benefit to do because people want to, you know, be a part of that and get to start from the beginning, that they started with issue 156 to suggest that there was some unfinished business there. Whose idea was that?
It was their idea.
It was their idea? And what did you think about it when they pitched it to you?
Well, it was fine with me because I didn't, you know, one reason I wanted to do it was I didn't really, you know, writing G.I. Joe is something I really don't even have to think about.
Right,
you know,
okay.
And, you know, anything else, you know, it just involves too much. Because I don't really read comics.
Right.
You know, when they gave me Wolverine, I hadn't ever read a Wolverine comic. And,
but you were familiar with the character, but you said
I knew who the character
right?
was, but I had never, you know, really read it. So I had to do a lot, you know, go back and I only read the Frank Miller, the Chris Claremont, and Barry Smith.
It's pretty much all you need, right?
And I figured, well, that's the canon.
That's right.
You know, everybody else is inconsequential.
Right.
You know, and I stuck with that. I guess I'm not part of the canon, but I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. So, do you consider now that the stuff that you wrote for Wolverine that is considered to be part of the canon? You're right there with those guys.
Yeah, but they've rewritten everything so far and changed everything, so like everything that I wrote is now obsolete.
Well, some people, I think, readers out there might choose to forget that some of that exists. Speaking of which, okay, so that brings me to this. Speaking of canon, so of course Joe ends in '95 with Marvel. Then was it Devil's Due picks it up in 2001, and it ran for a while. And as a fan of G.I. Joe, I couldn't help but read it. And I know that you did a few things with them, with an Origins book and all that.
I did Origins. I did. Well, the thing was, they didn't understand my process. The problem is, and IDW had all these G.I. Joe titles that weren't, a real American hero. Everybody always thinks they can do it better. And I said, well, look, first of all...
No one can do better.
Well, no, first of all these characters are based on people I know. So, if people don't know who these people are, the characters are not going to be consistent. The way I kept them consistent all that time was that there was a real life reference point that I could, reference.
That's big.
And
that's big.
And it kept everything really consistent.
I never considered that.
Yeah, and they don't know those people. Everything goes off character. And that's why I've never seen a single episode of the animation. Because they just
very different.
They didn't understand the characters,
right? And they had certain restrictions, I'm sure, that they had to follow as well.
And I didn't like the voices, for the most part. I thought Mary Mack, who did Lady J, was pretty good.
Yeah.
But I thought Cobra Commander and Destro were completely off character.
Well, they needed, I guess, to be cartoonish because they're cartoons. But I always wanted to know what you thought about those voices. So,
Destro, when I write Destro, I have Sean Connery.
For sure.
And
Scottish.
When I write Cobra Commander, it's Orson Welles. Or somebody thinks they're Orson Welles. Because he has to talk in these, oval tones and
slow
and very pompous. And uses lots of big words, polysyllabic, and he's full of himself.
Yeah,
he's not
this high-pitched kind of fraidy cat kind of thing.
No.
Yeah,
that bugged me.
Right. So that's interesting. So, when it comes to, I know, talking about restrictions, of course, there's the G.I. Joe movies and all that came out, the live action stuff, and they're enjoyable on their own face, but they're not the G.I. Joe story.
Right.
Weren't you hired to come on to be, at the very least, a consultant on some of these?
They hired me as a consultant on the first movie. Okay. And I read the first script, and they had Snake Eyes talking in the final, 10 minutes of the movie. And I said, no, you can't have that. And they said, well, no. We know he can't talk. That's why having him speak in the last 5 minutes is terrific.
No, that's...
And I said, but that's contrary to the character. He's not he didn't take a vow of silence. He can't talk. And that's when I realized that every other battle was not worth it. So I let everything else slide, and every day I would just send them a note that said, Snake Eyes can't talk. And finally, they actually shot the scenes where he talks. And finally they decided, and that's, I think, just by doing that, I earned my consultancy fee.
Yeah, well, but see, it's that kind of tone deafness that you've been battling. because the story of G.I. Joe, if people who know the story of G.I. Joe, like of course I know it, and as you wrote it, why not just tell that story? It's such a great story.
It's
What's
not just
wrong
a
with telling
story.
that story?
They don't understand the intrinsic fantasy. That G.I. Joe isn't a military fantasy. It's not a war book.
Right.
It's a fantasy about loyalty and camaraderie. Which to a 10-year-old kid is an extremely powerful fantasy, because every 10-year-old kid has been betrayed out there. And the idea of best friends that never let you down.
That's right.
And will stand up for you.
That's right.
If you're in trouble, they'll come and get you.
That's right.
That's a powerful fantasy, and it's also a fantasy of doing the right thing and having integrity without looking for the reward.
Wow.
And about duty and old-fashioned things like that to a kid represents order.
Yeah.
And
they respond to that.
It's very comforting. I hear from hundreds, literally, of people who say, my family life when I was a kid was really horrible. My parents were divorcing, they were fighting all the time, or I was being bullied, and all these horrible things. And they said that the G.I. Joe Universe was something that they could retreat into that was very comforting.
Yes.
And that was really a surprise to me.
Yeah?
Yeah, and when I started getting letters from the original G.I. Joe run, about 30% were from girls, which was really surprising.
Yeah.
And
did it change the way you wrote the book at all because of that?
Well, the thing is, what civilians, that's what I call non-comic don't realize is that if a comic book comes into a household and there's 5 kids in the household, every kid in that household will read that comic.
Right, sure.
Because it's there.
Yes.
I know that, I had girl cousins, and when I was a kid, they had stacks of comics, but they had girl comics.
Right.
They had Archies, they had Little Lulus,
Yeah.
they had
Sabrina.
Well, this is before Sabrina, but they had all the Harvey comics.
Right, sure.
Little
Star,
Archie, and all that stuff. And I read them. If they came to my house, they read my Supermans and stuff.
Yeah.
They would have Supermans and Lois Lanes and things like that, but not Batman. And
but it was the relation thing.
Yeah. So they would read a journalist, Susan Faludi, told me that she read the G.I. Joe comics because she was the only girl, and she had five brothers. So
she was probably exposed to some
she was
things
she got to play with G.I. Joe toys and read G.I. Joe comics.
Right.
Because that's what was there.
Right.
Yeah. And
you don't get to pick and choose at that age, right?
Right. You don't get to pick and choose, and it's there in the house. So that's what it was.
I was going to show you. You were talking about to continue this little series here. I was going to show you. Also to the cameras, you were talking about how Snake Eyes, of course, can't speak, falling on some tone-deaf ears in the movie industry. I see you have a blow-up of it right over there. This is about being a 10-year-old person. So this right here is something that I bought with my own money at age 10, back when they had the, do you remember the comics came in these little spin-around little racks at the drugstore? Spinners, right, okay. So bought at the local spinner rack at the thing there in 1984. I was 10 years old, whatever. And this is, of course, G.I. Joe readers, of course, will know this is the famous silent issue where there is not one word actually written to the entire thing. This, no pun intended, spoke to me in the same way that you were describing. I thought it was so powerful that you were able to tell this story, really give shape to the Snake Eyes character. When you went to your editor to say you were going to do this issue with no words, was there any pushback at all?
No, because what happened was that there was some sort of snafu and they were one issue short or something, so they needed to generate an entire issue in 3 weeks.
Oh, so it was a matter of a time constraint.
It was a time constraint thing, and the first thing I said was, well, look, if we don't get it lettered, we save an entire week. And if I write it and draw it myself, that saves another week and a half to 2 weeks. So I wrote it, quote unquote,
right,
and drew it in 3 days. About 7 pages a day. And Steve Lealoa did the finishes, so I did breakdowns, not finished pencils.
Right.
Which were pretty much like pencils without blacks spot on. And he inked it in like a week. And it went out. It wasn't the fastest we'd ever done a comic. I think me and Howie Chaykin and Vinnie Coletta hold the record. We did a James Bond movie adaptation, double-size issue, from having nothing to having it go out the door. We did it in 1 week. Script, pencil, ink, letter, color.
What fueled this? Like,
what?
What fueled this? Like, what were you listening to at the time? What music were you like? What?
It was,
7 days of punk rock, spitting this out in a week, right?
Yeah, it was. But that's what you had to do.
Yeah. So after you did the issue, were you like, man, they should all be like this? Like,
no, we got lots of letters from little kids saying, I got a faulty issue. All the lettering fell off.
I remember reading about that. There's some people who thought they had gotten like, hey, what happened to my comic this month?
Right, exactly. And some kids said, I was a rip-off because, it only took me like 3 minutes to read.
Well, they wait for all month for that hour or two. But I had the opposite effect. I didn't think it was faulty. I thought it was powerful. I remember showing it to my mom and thinking how cool it was. And there's really not been much like that done since. So you did another one later, didn't you?
I did. I think I did 2 of them.
You did 2 of them later on. But so going back to the IDW thing.
Well, that Marvel did. They did a whole anthology of comics without words. At one point, it was at a time when I was a pariah. So.
And they're still in your idea.
Yeah, they did the silent comic, and they never called me. Look, they did the entire 9/11 tribute issue. And I live like 2.5 blocks from the World Trade Center. I was there.
Yeah.
I could see people jumping from my window. Had to be evacuated from our apartment for over like 6 or 7 weeks. We couldn't go back.
And I remember you.
So I was the only comic artist or writer, who was an actual witness to the event, and they didn't bother to call me.
And again, like, why would, other than you just not shooting pool with the boys, like, why do you? I mean, first of all, it was your idea of the silent issue. You would have been the most informed about this. You would think that they would source it, for that. We're going to be done in about 7 minutes. So, do you want to take a break and take care of it real fast?
No.
Okay, good. Thank you, sir. I remember you saying on Facebook during the 9/11 anniversaries, you told a very harrowing story about after you guys were evacuated, and when you came back home, that some of these like armchair asshole patriots were calling people out of the phone book that had a last name that they didn't seem to recognize. So you were actually having to deal with messages on your
Hama is like Assyrian terrorists, the Hamas.
The Hamas, right.
Right. And yeah, I got all these hate messages on my Android.
I'll shoot you an email this week.
But like, look, after this last election, I've been told to go back where I come from. At least half a dozen times, by total strangers.
They were probably G.I. Joe readers.
I was on a plane, coming back from Australia. Some woman,
Thanks for the cold.
It was the middle of the night, so the lights were out. I went to the lavatory, and she had her foot sticking out into the aisle. And I stepped on her foot because I couldn't see it. And she yelled, and she looked at me, and she said, "What's wrong with you? You should just go back where you came from." And I said, "Well, I'm never moving back to Queens."
Amen, brother. For somebody who lived in Queens as well.
And I said, my mom.
Bless you.
My mom was born in Sacramento. My grandfather, came to the States in 1890. My family's been here longer than a lot of white people's families.
Bless you, Mr. Hama, for putting her in her place for that. It's such bullshit, man.
It's people now have a license to voice all the stuff that they've been, wise enough to keep quiet about.
Well, yeah. Well, it is unfortunate that people do tend to use those voices for other reasons. We try to tend to use our format and platform, the voice that we've worked for and been given to do nice things by, telling the truth, giving people good music and good stories, just like you have. What was some of the music that you were listening to and influenced by when you were writing G.I. Joe in the 80s?
Ramones.
Yeah, the Ramones, right.
But, there were bands that I always liked. I always liked the Kinks.
Yeah. Were you part of that whole CBGBs thing in the late 70s? I mean, did you go down to...
I played CBGBs a lot.
Yeah.
I had a band called the Chaotix.
Right. Max's Kansas City and all that as well.
Yeah. I didn't play Max's, but I used to hang out there.
Yeah, right.
And Danceteria. Played Danceteria. Played Irving Plaza. Played the Pyramid. Played Downtown Beirut.
That became Webster Hall, right?
Yeah, all those clubs.
Yeah.
And one of the original members of the band was Bobby London, who had done artwork for the Punk magazine, and so he knew the Ramones.
Wow.
So I got to go to parties at the Ramones loft.
Wow, my God.
I used to go to have sushi with Joey at this hole-in-the-wall sushi joint in East Village. Sort of in a basement.
Where you would go down the steps.
You had to go down the steps to get to this place, and it was so narrow. It was like there were no tables; it was just a counter. But it was good sushi.
Those are always the best places in New York. When I lived in Brooklyn for 8 years, there was always those little adventures of finding those little spots and all that.
Yeah. So it was. We.
So you were the punk, not the
It's
geek.
a fairly small world. I remember. Once we booked the rehearsal space at Daily Planet, which is a rehearsal studio, very popular rehearsal studio. And they said, well, room A that we want is occupied, but it'll be free in 20 minutes if you want to wait. So, okay, so we're sitting there waiting. And 20 minutes later, the door opens, and out troop the Kinks.
Oh. Talk about having a family moment.
Yeah, so, we go into the room, and Bobby London, ran around, and he was like, he took out his notepad, and he was writing down the settings on all the hymns.
This is before the internet, before you could get the levels on the mixer and all that. That's so awesome.
Yeah, he wanted, when did they set the,
Was this before he had done some artwork for them, or was this how he started to do some work for them?
he didn't do artwork for the Kinks.
Well, you said he did some artwork for
Punk magazine.
Oh, Punk magazine. Okay, there we go.
And for the Ramones.
For the Ramones, got it. Okay, cool. Okay. There we go. Okay. So he's sitting there. You know, I have to tell you, I toured with a band, and we did a tour. I wasn't in the band, but I was working with the band, and we toured with Motorhead. And the first thing I did was what you just described was, how does Lemmy get that sound out of his bass? You know, and so I can't hate on Mr. London for doing that, because I've done the same thing. So, but I always thought that was so cool, because, like I said, you were the punk, not the geek, and so that's why Marvel or whoever, you weren't, like you said, you weren't not necessarily a pariah, but you weren't one of the boys in their respect.
No, when I started there, I had hair down to my butt.
Yeah.
And I tended to wear black T-shirts with skulls on them.
I love those early photographs of you with the guitar and the long hair and like rocking out and stuff. Do you still play at all?
Yeah, I haven't played out in ages. I sold off all my big amps. I had like big Fenders.
Yeah.
They were all pre-CBS Fenders, so I got good money for them.
Well, I bet for sure. These were the old tube amps, right?
Yeah, I had a big Bandmaster with a big cabinet, and some smaller cabinets. But I held on to like the smallest. I have a pre-CBS Fender Champ.
Oh,
it's a
wow!
Sweet. And
but you got a pretty penny for that then.
A Champ it's with reverb.
Oh,
and,
man!
It's in perfect condition. I have a plexiglass Stratocaster that used to belong to John Cale.
Oh my gosh!
And it's used on the Lou Reed Blue Mascot.
How did you get it?
I was walking down 48th Street on Music Row.
Oh yeah, right. Sure.
And the guy at We Buy was putting it in the window as I was walking by.
That's kind of fake then, at that point.
And I just cashed a big, check.
Time to celebrate.
And I walked in and I bought it right on the spot.
Fantastic.
And it's the only guitar I've ever had that people kept trying to buy off me.
Yeah, well, sure. Well, and you still have it, right?
Yeah, I still have it. Yeah. So it's my main axe. I have a pre-CBS blonde Strat, also a Fender.
People need to see and hear what this stuff sounds like. You should book a gig soon, man.
Well, there's video on YouTube.
Of you playing it? We're going to have to include this in the episode.
Yeah, when we played... A couple of times when we played CBGB's, we had a video.
I've never seen that. I'll have to look for that.
Who come with us, and you slip the sound guy at CBGB's, at 20, and he'll plug your camera into a direct feed into the board.
Sure.
You don't get the audience feed.
Right. It's that.
But the sound system at CBGB's was amazing, and their sound engineers were really good. They had 8 mics just on the drum kit.
Whoa. Look how loud that is. Can you imagine how loud that is?
And so the drums and the bass, and they would mic the amps.
Yeah.
They put the Shure SM57
right in,
right onto the head, and so you got this amazing bottom.
Yeah. Just that very heavy.
Yeah. And a real snap, because they knew how to mic a drum kit. You point the mic at the edge of the cymbals.
That's right.
Things like that.
Yeah.
They knew how to do that.
Yeah.
Lots of places you go, they don't know how to mic drums.
On my experience of touring and stuff, I can attest to that for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
were you there the last night with Patti Smith and all that? Whenever.
No, I saw Patti Smith play there.
Oh wow.
I saw Blondie play there. We used to go, clubbing with the Nashville Lampoon crowd.
Oh my God.
go to a bar called the Bells of Hells, and sometimes after the bells goes down, we go over and see these.
Was it in the Bowery as well?
No, Bells of Hell was on the west side of the village.
Okay.
I think it's still there, but it's no longer the Bells of Hell. But yeah, it was a heady time.
Well, yeah, man, late 70s, early 80s. But how cool that you were right in the thick of it, and then you found a way to be an artist yourself.
Yeah.
Do you find it unlikely at all?
What?
That, I mean, again, like I said, you know, again, you're a punk from the village, and what became was something probably very different from what you had originally thought when you were, you know, let's say in your early 20s in the 1970s.
No, I never had expectations. You know,
Yeah.
Just took it day by day.
Yeah.
And I was more interested in, you know, comics didn't occupy my whole life.
That's right.
I still belong to all three acting unions. And, you know, once in a while I get together with other players and we still jam. And, the one thing I never got into see, one of the reasons I don't get work is that none of my friends are writers. I mean, I started out drawing. You know. I don't call myself an artist. I think the name artist is an appellation, not a job description.
It is.
Calling yourself an artist is like calling yourself a poet. It's just bull. You know, it's like, you're not a poet. You're just a rhymer. You know, and, you know, if you're a poet, people will call you a poet.
That's right. You don't call yourself a poet.
No, you don't call yourself an artist either. I think it's really that's right. So
You can say bullshit on the show.
yeah. So most of my friends in the business are the guys that draw the stuff. You know, I don't hang out with the writers. All the editors are writers.
Yeah.
And all the editors who are writers aren't very happy about artists that write their own stuff because that takes away their
For sure.
job.
Well, here is to keep rocking, Mr. Hama.
Okay.
You have done so much awesomeness, and like I said, I hope you keep. I would love to see you book a gig soon. Come see you rock out, my friend.
Well, you know, if you go on YouTube, do a search for Chaotix, K-O-T-I-C-S, and CBGBs.
Okay.
Because there's 3 other bands called the Chaotix.
Okay.
And one of them's a Korean boy band.
we're gonna go. Hey, is that Larry right there? In the boy? So it's very clear to our listeners that are listening now.
It was all
our
recorded
watchers.
at CBGBs in the early 90s, 91.
91. Okay. I can't wait to see that. I didn't know that existed.
Yeah.
Mr. Hama, you've been so generous with your time today. I can't thank you enough.